our neighbor, it has literally become our belief system that that is indeed human nature. And I want to challenge that today in this mastermind about sharing. When we observe children, when we observe babies playing with other babies, they will share their food, they will feed each other because that is what they have learned from their parents, hopefully, right? We're being fed by our mother and we want to feed the child playing with us. And then comes the era of recognition that I am me, and then the word becomes, mine. And that whole era, I feel, is where humanity has been over these 6,000 years. The era of mine. But to put that into a more intellectual context, the era can be, of course, defined as patriarchy and the era of ownership and defining ourselves as humans by what we own and whom we own. And I'm saying whom because, as we all know, everybody under the king was owned by the king in so many ways. If the king said, go to war, you went to war. If the king said, give me your harvest, you gave your harvest, etc. Of course, not always necessarily voluntarily, but as a notion, that's been the case. And often willingly so, because there was this adoration of those that are the leaders. And we still have that today in the form of admiration, in the form of celebrity cultism, in the form of admiring the rich and famous and feeling that we are lesser. If only we could kiss the ground on which they walk or shake their hand, God forbid, as though we need that symbol of something that we are not. And yet, over the last 200 years, there has been a new era of realization that each human being has value. And I'm now talking just about the Western world. Whereas when living in cultures that have remained in more indigenous social orders, such as some Native Americans, such as African communities that I encountered in Africa, such as communities where we don't have the empirical structures in place. So we come from this whole era and we've lost that communal connectivity, and therefore we're okay with, or not even aware of, the fact that the West has only been able to exploit, to be so wealthy, if you will, as a whole, or everybody has a car and we have roads and we have phones and we have bridges and trains and so forth, because we actually, in almost like a zero-sum game, impoverished those places on the planet, mostly the so-called Southern Hemisphere, where people have been subjected to colonialism, and after colonialism, neo-colonialism, that is direct exploitation of all the resources without sharing the benefit. And therefore, we could have all these cheap plastics, we could have all these cheap clothes, we could have all these cheap cars, etc., 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 in the so-called developed world. So what we don't realize very often is that we only have this kind of developed world because we have impoverished and de-developed, underdeveloped, intentionally underdeveloped the majority of the people on the planet. And now we're at a time where that is shifting, where that awakening is happening. And I liken that awakening to the awakening of the women in society. We're coming into an age where we have said, I don't want to be owned by my husband anymore. I don't want to have my children sold to another family or into a labor camp. I don't want to anymore be in that position. And while we will have lots of women in today's conservative camps who said, yeah, but it was better for us, it was healthier that we were at home with our children. And still, it cannot be negated, it cannot be denied that we, the women, are moving into a new era of our own empowerment and of our voice being heard in society. And still, we want to have children, and still, we love to be mothers, and still, we want to be the caregivers and caretakers of our families. That is still true, and it is all possible. So we share ourselves into the society in a very new way. And that is now true for all the countries that have been so terribly exploited. And just like with us women, there will be some who say, yeah, but it was better when, we had the white guys organizing our life and we all knew our place. There will be those, but they are lesser and lesser in numbers. And therefore, we have BRICS, the getting together of nations who say we don't want war anymore. There are now 11, and their former complete enemies like Saudi Arabia and Iran are both in there. And they say, we don't want war anymore. We want to collaborate and see if we can co-support each other, co-develop, collaborate in what we can give and take from and to each other. And for Americans, that is very, very difficult to understand, that there is such a notion. We tend to just suspect that, oh, they're only doing that because they want to rule the world, right? They're only doing that because they want to, etc. Because humans have the typical notion that we have the perspective that is the correct perspective, and we project that onto the rest of humanity, onto our neighbors, our children, etc. Of course, we know that we should be putting ourselves into the other person's shoes, in air quotes, right? And still, it's so hard to do that. But that's what is shifting, that other nations as a whole are really saying, we are not about conquering. We are not about exploitation. We are about collaboration. And I deeply believe that this new form of coexisting and co-supporting each other will lead into the next era of humanity. Of course, for those of you who are into the stars and the planetary eras, I know very little about that, and I'm putting that out here. But there is the planetary era moving into the Aquarius era, right? It's been going on for a few decades already, and it's going to take another few more decades until you really feel that we are in this new era. I always say, I'm feeling it every day. Just yesterday, I was saying to a gentleman who was saying, yeah, but it's human nature that we have patriarchy and, and this and that and the other. I was saying I wouldn't be standing here talking to you at an intellectual level that you couldn't even recognize were we still in that era. So I wanted to start with this large picture that is actually providing the background to what is now happening in the world. What is now happening is that we are indeed given the opportunity to begin to collaborate. And that doesn't mean that the powers that be, the powers at the global empire, which is now attempted to be that global empire, right? I mean, we all know about the various entities. What we don't know is that behind those entities, those three-letter entities that are trying to do the finances of the world and the rules of the world and the health of the world, that behind those entities are the same powers still coming from the royal and billionaire and owners of everything. And that, I don't want to use those words that everybody uses, but that group of people still is behind the new ways of luring us into compliance and into, yes, please save me from this enemy or from this disease or from this whichever. Yeah. So therefore, coming into our own and saying, oh, what's behind the scenes? Is it maybe the last grasp to hold on to those empirical structures? And maybe it's not the last, there could be other lasts, but it is also very visibly failing that grasp, because we are here and we're seeing those collaborative efforts. And I had a really interesting little conversation with a client of mine who was a bit upset that I was being somewhat, she said, what was the word she used? She said, not using derogatory attitude, but using a patronizing attitude. Whereas, of course, I'm at the woman. The patrony, of course, comes from the word man, father, right? So I was patronizing in this conversation where I made somebody realize that they were still stuck in patriarchy in their thinking. So the awareness of these difficult little steps that we are making every day in realizing that, yes, there will be more grasps of control and more grasps of finding different avenues, whether via weather control, or I've known for decades that that has been a plan, or via bioweapons, and that those have been going on since the early 1900s. So all of those modalities are, however, no longer really working because there are so many billions now. So of course, I'm saying billions and there are not so many billions on the planet, but about 2 to 3 billion of us humans are beginning to understand that that's what's going on. And we're saying, we don't really want that anymore. We actually enjoy collaboration, teamwork, group celebrations, supporting each other, because ultimately, and that's all under sharing, that's what makes us joyful and happy and fulfilled is the word. It actually fulfills us that we have a sense of contributing to the community. So what does that all have to do with health and all those other businesses that I typically talk about, right? What does that have to do with what we eat? What does that have to do with how we clothe ourselves? What does that have to do with the immediate situation in our local environment? Everything. Because beginning with what we eat, of course, there is the movement, more local, more organic, more direct from the ground, more foraging, more backyard growing, more indoor sprouting. All of those elements mean that we can actually physically share those goods with each other because they are not taken or stolen from other places. When we get those wagon loads of bananas from any banana republic, that's where that term comes from, right? A banana republic is a country that has been completely submitted to a corporation that now exploits those bananas, and the local people who lived on that land where we now grow bananas no longer has access to that land, no longer has access even to those bananas, and no longer has a means to feed themselves. Why do you think we have so many immigrants? Why do you think we have so many people who try to find a better life for their children? Because their land physically and their ability to make a living has been taken away. So when their countries are now saying, we have all these coups in Africa rebelling against the French colonizers, who were probably the most drastic in just continuing, in fact, giving those countries a document upon signing their independence. They had to also sign the continuation of colonialism. And this is all in French, and I know it's often not translated, and I speak French, so I can actually hear the original discussions and read the original documents. That is how bad neocolonialism is. And when these new young people now say, no more, this is our land, we want our land, this is our gold, our diamonds, our silver, our nickel, our uranium, you name it, it's ours. Of course, I go as far as saying, isn't it time to realize that certain minerals should not even be used, like uranium? Isn't it time to realize that we made gold this value thing that it really doesn't have to be? It's a mineral. It does some beautiful things and some good, but we have assigned something to it that it doesn't have to be, because then we can own it and we can hoard it. So there's so much more to learn in terms of coming into this new era of sharing, but I would love to hear a couple of your opinions and or questions that you may have. And you can put the questions either in the chat or show your faces. Shirley, you have to show your face if you want to pose a question. I would love to have other questions. How does it impact our life today? And, or excuse me. I can hear you, Ben. No, I cannot hear you, Ben, for some reason. You unmuted
Would
yourself.
you ask your last question again, please? How is it?
What are your questions that come up with this view of why we need to learn to share?
Gee, I have no questions. I agree 1000%.
Okay. Well, thank you.
There is also, a group which I belong to, the oraclegirl.org group.
Mhm.
We are, there's a planned meeting in Vermont in a couple of weeks, which is about sharing.
Caring or sharing?
Sharing.
Also sharing.
Oh,
Yeah.
because we know, I mean, I have felt for a long time the reason we are here, or the way of being in our lives on earth, is to be here for each other, which of course includes sharing. And when we are all here for each other and not in any other way, everybody has enough. Everybody has, a place to live, enough to eat, and all of this is possible.
Yeah, beautifully said. All of it is possible. It's just that 200 years ago or 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, this was still a very difficult proposition to make, because people would say, well, it's human nature to want to have more than your neighbor, to want to be better, faster, bigger, stronger. And that is beginning to change. I've often said, and I'm repeating it here again, that my dear friend Patrick Baboumian, one of the strong men, with world records in the world, who, is strong on a plant-based diet, says it is no longer about competing with others, it's about competing with yesterday. So this here being better than yesterday. Sharing, of course, also has another aspect. So many of the people who do not want to comply, who do not want total control, etc., are talking about freedom. And I will say, what is freedom? Well, that I can do what I want, when I want, where I want. Well, what about the people who were there before you, where and when you want to do what you want? And then we get to the actual definition for humans of freedom. Freedom is not if I can just kill and maim anybody. Melissa, welcome. You found the working link. So what is it then that is freedom? Freedom is the co-responsibility for the other person's freedom. So then you have, again, sharing, right? Imagine a limited space and one person, and there's 10 people in that limited space, and one person comes in there and says, I'm free. I claim this space. What about if everybody wants to claim the space? Then we get to sharing the space. So my freedom ends where I infringe upon another person's freedom. And of course, the whole transaction has to be preceded with us giving every human being an equal right to be, to life, right? What happened that so few people talk about is, of course, in the Americas, and that goes north and south, the Europeans barged in there and said, this is mine now, my freedom. I can shoot, maim, burn down, and starve everybody who's been here before, because I have the God-given right to be free on this land. So it wasn't about freedom of everybody. It was only about freedom of those who had the will to kill. My most opened email in a long time was "Killing makes a killing," where we discuss exactly that. Killing makes a killing. And we're still in that mindset, even though we don't realize it, that we can just take because there's this divine right that we claim to submit, subdue, and exploit others, just because, well, apparently they're not as willing to make a killing as we are. So, but let's explore a little bit more of what that has to do with the food we eat. Again, we talked about the Banana Republic, and it also translates into, of course, what makes the most money are the products that are the most controllable and the most ownable is not a word, but let's just make that a word, that you can own. And while you can own land, you still have to allow nature to do its thing. And we've transformed the natural growth of plants and animals into our industrial approach to things. Therefore, we have factory farms. We have factory growing grounds now as well, and vertical growing grounds. We have machinery and fertilizers and genetic modification that are trying to exploit, get more out of what nature provides, right? And at the same time, we're beginning to realize how getting more, making more, so that we can sell more and make more profit actually destroys the very nature out of which we want to derive our supplies. So it will last for a short time, but then it will collapse because the soils are collapsing. The food supplies for the animals will collapse because you can only put so much poison onto a soil and then it won't grow anymore. And for me, the most ironic one is, to own the seeds that you genetically modified so that they don't produce viable seeds. So how much of an organic seed vault do you have to have in order to even continue to modify these seeds so that they don't grow, but they have to still grow. They just don't produce viable seeds. It's so ludicrous. It cannot perpetuate itself because we have cut the perpetuation itself off in the root, so to speak. So if you understand that life is a life cycle and it moves in circular motions, albeit in a direction, right? Because there is evolution within those life cycles, or adaptation, for example, when the weather changes, there's adaptation of the life cycle. And trying to own those natural life cycles is where the buck stops. When you interfere with chemicals, etc. So when you try to own everything, interestingly, you're chopping your legs off. You can no longer walk forward because the supply that nature provides will end. So I don't know whether I didn't express that very well, but did I make myself clear? Can
I
I get
think
it?
so.
Okay, thank you, Ben. So, and a little bit more to how has ownership as a principle, ownership of land, ownership of crops, ownership of people, of course, and ownership of intellectual property influenced this whole development toward ownership and competition instead of sharing and collaboration. So we have this interesting development again, that the more you own, the more you erode the supply of what puts you in that ownership. Let's have a little stretch like the cat in the background. So the more you erode the basis of what keeps you supplied with your profits and your riches, the less you will, or the closer you get to the collapse of the system. And while that can take hundreds of years, I am hopeful that it will only take a couple of decades, because there's so many of us working in this new direction of sharing and collaboration. So, what do we need to enable us to share? Interestingly, we need confidence. Isn't that strange? Why do we need confidence to be able to share? Integrity, being at home in ourselves. In order to share, we need to have a securedness that we're not coming from scarcity. Ben, you and I have talked about this before, right? In order to be able to share, we have to have a confidence in that there is enough for both of us, for all of us. And that confidence is derived out of a very different notion than what we've been taught in competitiveness and in this fear of sliding down the scale of virtue and value and ownership. So when we have that confidence, whether we have a lot or whether we have nothing, we can share with joy, because there's no fear of scarcity or of losing, of loss, of sliding down the scale in the social agenda, in the social structure. So what I'm going toward is that there are new social structures that colleagues of mine and people I never heard of have invented and are working at. And one of them is called the Gradido model. Gradido.net is in many languages now. And I would love for you to all explore that. And because I've almost talked for an hour, oh my goodness, I need to invite you all to work with me to find your place where you want to participate, where you find your gift and your confidence to work your gift into the whole, into the collaboration with others. Without your being at home in yourself, it is very difficult, because then we either try to join the exploiters, or we try to join the victims, which also we feel exploited, we feel victimized, we feel weak. So growing into your confidence, what did you come to Earth to do? What did you come here to contribute? Most of us actually deep inside know that. So I'm just letting somebody else in, Grace. Most of us know what that is. Welcome, Grace. And as I'm going to summarize all that I've said, I want to invite you all to ask yourselves, what is it in this lifetime that is my very special, very unique, very wonderful contribution to the whole? And it's different for every single one of us. It's different. Many people have sort of invented categories. You know, there are the supporters and the controllers and the promoters, and, you know, they've sort of created these character categories, and they are helpful sometimes for us to self-analyze. You know, where am I happiest? I was just listening to a woman who for 10 years had looked after dying people in a hospice. And she made a category of 5, she made this list of 5 things that people most regretted. And number 1 was, I wish I had been more of myself. I wish I had done more of what I really am here to do, of myself. I thought that was really revealing. That was number 1. More than I wish I had gone and hiked the Himalayas, or I wish, you know, all of those things. But I wish I had been more of myself and not allowed others to define me. So, yeah, allow yourselves, and we all allow ourselves to be helped by others to step into that place where we say, yeah, this is really, really who I am. This is what I give to the world and to humanity. So ask yourselves that. Oops, and I wanted to put Gradido into the chat. What if we were all tied in the system one way or the other, not completely free? So how will the sharing be possible on a large scale? Yeah, you're absolutely right, Melissa. What is it? How do we make this sharing more possible? Of course, there's so many approaches. There's the approach that we start in a small group around us, in larger groups, but there's also the approach that we spread the concepts more in societies, that we look at what other societies are trying to do among their population. It's yeah, there's so many different ways in which we can promote this concept of sharing. And of course, it doesn't mean that we can give everything away we have, because we can only live if we acquire monetary support. There's no way we can live on planet Earth. I always say, you know, you have to pay to be alive. If you stop paying, you're going to be on the street and possibly dead sooner. Well, yeah, most of us don't want to be an outcast. Most of us want to feel a sense of belonging. Most of us want to feel that we belong to a group and that we understand. And understanding is another thing. That's why, you know, my latest email this morning was about the tears I cried when I was listening to Dr. David Martin explain so beautifully what humanity has lost because of this ownership of everything and everybody. And the documentary is called Future Dreaming. I don't know where it is available other than on, I think I saw it on one of his websites. Yeah, we have lost so much by allowing ourselves to go through the system. Now, I, as a philosopher, also argue that all of humanity needed to go through this terribly divisive and warring and destructive era in order to come into the realization that we are individually co-responsible, which I believe is a new thing, because you can only really share if you are individually responsible. Otherwise, it's not sharing in the truest sense. It's just doing what everybody does, right? Or being told to do things, to cut the cake in so many pieces so that everybody gets one. If I'm sharing truly from my own, I'm sharing truly from me, I have to have, that's why I said you have to have confidence, but I also have to have a sense of I'm individually responsible for my actions. I'm not the victim, I'm not forced, I'm not the performer of that which is asked of me, but I am making the decision that I am the one sharing. So in order to come into an individual co-responsibility, we may have had to go through these thousands of years of dividing us into different groups at war, etc. Because I think, at least everything that I can find, the eras before had more of a group consciousness. Among others, Rian Eisler describes that in The Chalice and the Blade. And when you look at very old cultures from 100,000 years ago and older, and yes, they were there. I am aware and trust that they were. I understand that they were. I don't like the word believe, because it in and of itself suggests that it's not true. We just believe it, right? So from an era in which we had more of a clan consciousness, more of a family group consciousness, in which we were co-thinking about things, we are now coming into an individual thinker era. And we have to create community out of our individual decision to join or create that community. And that's a very different notion. It makes us literally, for the first time, responsible, each and every one of us, not just the king, who, by the way, also wasn't really responsible, because they would say, well, I got the command from God, right? Or from the next king. So this is the time where we become co-responsible for our actions. And I'm saying co because, of course, we still are in the structure of society, so we can't just scramble everything and make a clear and decisive individual decision. We're still in the grip of that which is. But within that, we can find others who have the sense of this co-responsibility, and therefore, and again, talking to Melissa, finding those that are on the path is part of the journey of coming into our intentional communities. You know, not for nothing are there so many thousands and thousands of intentional communities around the globe now. Eco villages and hippie villages and religious villages and all kinds of different belief systems and philosophies, but people who get together because they're not blood relatives, they're not of the same profession, they're not of the same background or monetary level of riches, but they come together because they individually decide, this is where I want to belong, or this is where I want to collaborate. Does that make sense? So therefore also sharing is the next era of us being individually co-responsible. Same with freedom is being co-responsible for the other person's freedom. Yeah. And of course, in order to live more of that, we need an entirely different system. You know, people say, yeah, but look what communism and socialism did. They made it worse. Yeah, because yes and no. I trust or I understand that those movements have made contributions to our understanding of that the old hierarchical structures are not the only ones viable anymore, right? The farmer can now be a professor and the professor can now be a mason or that family. You know, the clan system has been broken by those big socialist communist movements. Ironically, however, because we still have the superstructure, when you really dig deep, you learn that those two were largely funded by the world money holders. You know, two of them start with the letter R, and you may very well know who they are. RO, actually, both. You know, one in the banking and money industry, the other one in the ownership of railroads. And then there's Carnegie and others that belong to that, and all the royalties belong to that clan. Until not so recently, they were called the Bilderbergers. That's now transformed into a three-letter acronym. And again, I don't want to talk about what they are now. I think you can all understand what they are. So we can see that what has been attempted as a liberation of the labor force, the serfs, etc., the slave populations has, however, changed, upheaved the system in spite of the fact that those movements were co-sponsored and corrupted back into a dictatorship in many cases. Yeah, thank you for that, Melissa. I'm just reading your chat text. All right, let us wrap up. And for all of you who are listening to this later, please feel free to still ask your questions in the comments, and I will see them and I will respond. My YouTube channel is not big yet. I've only just started a podcast, and you find me under Johanna's Raw Foods on YouTube. All my activities on YouTube and my uploads are under that, and the whole Mastermind series is there. And of course, johannasrawfoods.com is the website where you can connect with me via the contact button. But also, wherever you see this content, feel free to connect, because again, it starts with connection, and I love helping people grow into their own very individual power. That's part of my gift to the world. And yes, I still have to pay my bills. It's not all for free, but it's a lot less than in most other situations. So, in short, and wrapping it up, the next era is about sharing. We better learn now, because we also have to learn as prices are rising, because the cheap provisions are no longer as cheap. And we have to learn to waste less. That's actually on my big list here that I tend not to even look at once I get started. So we have to learn to waste less in the West. We have to learn to use local resources with each other, share with each other, and be aware of that which we have coming because of the exploitation of others, and reversely be encouraging our children and grandchildren to love the fact that they're growing into this era of much freer individual human beings who are allowed to be just good humans, as opposed to being part of these oppressive systems. It's a beautiful thing. And yes, they're trying, but they're not going to get away with it. The grasping is over. All right. Any last words? Any comments from those present? I would love to hear, whether in the chat or in. Grace says, hi, Johanna, nice to see you and catch up. I missed the time. Just want to say hello. Thank you, Grace. Great to hear from you. I hope you're doing well. And, feel free to book a time with me. Those short discovery calls are free. So you can certainly do that. You can book a time with me by connecting on my website or by going to calendly.com/Johanna-3. So many ways to connect with me. Keeping very busy, good to hear.
This is Ben. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
I just would like to mention, yes, communism didn't work because they were actually totalitarianism in the world history. And we do have a history of true communism, which was the monastic process, where everybody really, lived together and worked together. And it was, definitely a unit. And then also the kibbutzim, the original kibbutzim in the desert. They were really seemed to be more of a sharing and really what communism was about. The rest was
right. And unfortunately, I have to, of course, put that again into context, because the kibbutzes were still on land that had been taken away from the people who lived there.
Yeah.
The concepts were great. So instead of going in and saying, let's do this together with what's here, that wasn't possible, because the mindset was not everybody is a human, only we are the important humans now, right? So that's the sad part about that. But yes, I mean, the thoughts have been in humanity for a while. The thoughts, it must be possible to collaborate. Now we have to figure out ways to implement. But it's good to see these attempts in many places. What was the first example you mentioned?
Monastic existence.
So you're talking about
the monasteries.
Monasteries. And of course, they are either all male or all female. And therefore, again, very exclusive. And you have to subscribe to a certain lifestyle. which then gets broken because it's very, very unnatural to prohibit humans from any kind of love or procreation or exchange of sexuality. So you basically invite, I always said, you invite perversion when you force Puritanism of any kind. So, yeah, but nevertheless, we can learn from these models because we see what they were missing, right? And we
Yes.
can then do the next level and attempt to incorporate the recognition of nature and the way that existence on the planet works. It works. Oh, in my podcast, I was talking about that, of course, life equals reproduction. Life is reproduction. Without reproduction, there is no life, because the life cycle has to always grow the next and the next and the next, right? And that goes for all of life, from the bacterium to the human to the oak tree. So, yeah, if we
And
only recognize that, we get ahead.
And most plants are very generous in their reproduction because they give us so many more seeds than they need for reproduction, which we can then use. And no, I guess I brought this up about the two cases because the rest of it was actually totalitarianism. And, people talk about communism today. It's not communism, it's totalitarianism. And the
Yes,
intention of so-called communism today is still really totalitarianism.
yes. And yeah, and still, it's again a kick in a direction that went wrong, and we have to do another kick in the direction to hopefully go less wrong, right? That's the way evolution or evolvement into a new existence on the planet
Yeah,
hopefully works.
these two examples were where people shared,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
they were
No, you're absolutely correct.
here for each other, which is, yeah. And then of course, hey, they were still part of what we're mentioning now and then human nature, which comes most of the human nature really originated thousands of years ago, quote unquote, from the fear of not making it, so then needing to acquire.
Well,
And
I disagree, because that's an era. The era of fear comes with the era of ownership, possession, and scarcity, right? Before that, I think we had an era of this collective consciousness, which you can still see in some indigenous communities that have mostly died out. Riane Eisler describes it as the Minoan culture on the island of Crete in Greece had that for a long time still. So this communal consciousness, where even your brain worked in telepathic collaboration with each other, was before all of that warring and fear environment. But I have met many people who live in nature and have some of that indigenous understanding of how nature works. They don't have fear. They don't have fear of the tiger eating them, or the jaguar, or the whatever, or the snake. There is a communication and collaboration. And yes, you have to be aware. And yes, you want to be doing the right thing to respect their space so that they respect your space, and all of these kind of things. But yeah, we need to learn from that to carry into the individually co-responsible era. All right, guys, please communicate with me. Please allow us to work together. Please bring to the world that which you have, that is your very, very special gift. And yeah, of course. I mean, reproduction, it's not just the fruits that are a plenty, you know, human sperm is also a plenty, and one man could literally repopulate if that were the way it worked. But it doesn't. It only works that some have this purpose and others have another purpose, and others are just part of the production. So, yeah, of course, sperm also is a plenty and very wasteful, if you will, you know. So are human eggs. I mean, I probably still have a bunch of eggs in my womb that I will never be able to use because they were created there, or they come with the package, right? Yeah. Yeah, of course. That's exactly it, what Melissa is saying here, that artificial man-made systems in reproduction will ultimately fail because the powerful natural reproduction is the only one that works on this little planet. You know, we have all kinds of ideas. We should put our ideas to collaborating with nature as opposed to against nature. We can do a lot of beautiful things, sharing with nature the natural energies and powers and resources that plants, rocks, and waters give us. All right, guys, it is late and I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for being here. And I hope to, oh, there's more. Well, Melissa, feel free to make a time for us to talk. And I'm happy to provide that time. All right. Shirley, I haven't heard from you. Normally I hear a couple of sentences from you. Can you put something in the chat? And Grace just left. And if I'm not hearing from Shirley and from 646, I shall say goodbye. I love you guys and everybody who's listening to this at a later time. I can't wait to hear from you and hear your opinions, or also what you found interesting in this presentation. Okay? And go ahead and share. It makes you so happy. Ciao.
Now,